The NDIS has been helping those with disability live more independently for a decade now, but we know the scheme is far from perfect and people have been taking advantage of that. Four Corners tonight is diving into how the NDIS overcharges and some of the fraudulent conduct where service providers may be manipulating the scheme for profit and sometimes at the consequence of care. River Knight is an avid disability advocate from regional Queensland. He's a worker with developing Australia communities, and he's speaking here with Drive's Braden Jason, who starts by asking River how common fraudulent behaviour is when it comes to the NDIS in regional areas.
I think the overcharging is a huge issue. It's definitely rampant because it's intentional, but it's also unintentional. So we have a situation where service providers often accidentally overcharge and don't know how to understand the system, because we have a lot of well-meaning people establishing service provider organisations and not understanding how to do what they need to do. But then we also have the intentional perfect storm within NDIS where we have a vulnerable population that's not good at self-advocating, and we also have participants who may and may not have family members and people physically going and checking up on them regularly, especially within regional areas, to make sure that service providers are not doing the right thing, because what happens is the service provider becomes the sole person that person has contact with. So they end up self-regulating. So if they're doing the wrong thing, they're certainly not going to dob themselves in. In the regional areas, what we see a lot of is that there's not the supports and the checks and balances that we may be able to get in the city. So we already have a huge deficit of checks and balances in the NDIS space because we had millions and millions of dollars taken away from advocacy groups, and that hasn't been replaced by the NDIS. It was cut when it rolled out and it hasn't been replaced yet. So we've created hugely risky situation by doing that. And then we've also compounded that by going out regionally where those sorts of services were hard to access in the first place.
River, what safeguards are in place to stop these fraudulent activities taking place in the state?
Well, here in Queensland, we have the Office of Public Guardian, which is an independent office. It has the power to go in, or used to have the power to go in, visit participants living in group settings with service providers that are funded to support them. They could check anything, look at anything, and they were our check and balance to make sure that people weren't doing the wrong thing. And they had nothing to do with the people funding the service, and they didn't have anything to do with the service provider that was delivering it. They had the power to independently check and balance what was going on. And when NDIS kicked in, that service, the amount of visitable sites was incredibly decreased, and the people that they're now visiting are only people that are flagged on the system that are having restrictive practices and things that are a little bit more scary going on in their lives. But the thing is, the only way we know about that is when service providers tell Public Guardian. So there's a self-check method in place right now, and the Office of Public Guardian was and continues to be one of our only safeguards where people just go in, have a look, they visit the community and make sure that things are okay. And right now, we desperately need that. And for me, that's one of our solutions in terms of managing the dodgy services that are out there.
Have you heard of any examples across Queensland where people may have been overcharged?
Absolutely. So here in Queensland, I've had so many cases that I've been involved with. Like I had one recently where a young man was funded and worked with a service provider for a period of about 3 to 4 years, where that service provider was funded 24-hour one-on-one funding for this participant, which equates to about $500,000 a year, just for this one person to have one staff member within 24 hours a day, because they're vulnerable and they're not able to be left alone because they're not safe alone. And that service provider decided to just not bother providing support to that participant 6 hours a day. But we still are going to claim the funds for that participant. So they took the funding, they put it in their pocket, they didn't provide the service. So 6 hours a day times 7 days a week times 365 days a year, that's a lot of funding that was pocketed for services that weren't delivered. And when that service provider was confronted by the Guardian, who wasn't told, and of course by NDIS when the complaints were raised, they admitted to that. Sadly, when the NDIS Commission looked into the complaint for this particular matter, their outcome was to say, well, we can't actually prove that they did it because the service provider won't give us a roster to tell us and show us that they didn't provide those hours. Even though they admitted to it, they put it into writing, everyone knew it happened. The participant themselves used to complain about them not having staff there 6 hours a day. So the consequences aren't there. There's no incentive to do the right thing. And when there's no incentive to do the right thing and there's no, I guess, push to police or worry, it's a perfect storm for criminals. And any other situation, if I went to a government agency to get a $500,000 a year grant, I would have to do so much paperwork and jump through so many hoops to get that money. Yet within NDIS, it just seems to be automatically approved. And what we're seeing that's very scary is the automation and the standardized decision-making when we're talking about individual unique experiences of disability is starting to look very scary to us because what we're seeing is another risk of another robo-debt.
Well, he couldn't have put it any more bluntly, could he, River Knight there? He's a disability advocate. Speaking with Drive's Braden Jason, ahead of tonight's Four Corners investigation into fraud within the National Disability Insurance Scheme and this overcharging by service providers. Have any of you heard or had any experience with this? Seems it might be more common than we'd hoped. Probably not completely unexpected that if a new system's set up, particularly one that deals in billions of dollars of funds to be issued and handed out, that some will game the system. But I must say it's pretty demoralising to hear stories like that. If any of you have had any experience with fraud or what you believe to be fraudulent behaviour with NDIS, we'd be keen to hear about it. Send us a text, 0487 993 222, 1300 801 222 if you want to give us a call.